Mesopotamia Series, Episode 1, Gilgamesh the Sumerian. If you want to know about the historical Gilgamesh, not the epic version that was posthumously exaggerated into 2/3 demigoddom, but the actual historical human Gilgamesh, you can't find very much on YouTube. And a lot of what you do find is the kind of thing they play on the quote-unquote History Channel, with a lot of time given to the Anunnaki and other ideas from what we'll call pseudoscience, to be polite. This is not a video like that. Welcome to the Dawning Podcast, where we talk about ancient history and not about aliens. This pilot episode is called Gilgamesh the Sumerian, and is part 1 of a 4-part series on Mesopotamia. You probably already know about the Epic of Gilgamesh, and if you head to YouTube, you'll find many fine retellings and summaries of the epic poem, some of which I'm going to link in the description. Gilgamesh, however, was an historical figure, and it's my intention to share his actual historical life in this podcast today. First, allow me to recite my disclaimer. I have no applicable credentials, no official or professional background in ancient history, but I do have the privilege of having both the passion and the means to learn about ancient history and share what I learn. While this is my hobby, I strive to vet all of my sources and bring you only the historical facts as they are understood by the professionals within the historical research community. If I'm incorrect, I will try to fix my mistake as soon as I can, but I can only get better if I am told. So please don't hesitate to leave a comment below or to visit my website, thedawningpodcast.wordpress.com. We'll start today by giving some context to the area and period that surrounds the epic and the real life of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. Next, we will briefly summarize the chapters of the Epic of Gilgamesh. We will talk about the dating of the chapters and who ordered them to be written. From there, we're going to talk about the events leading up to Gilgamesh's reign, then discuss the history of the man himself, and in our conclusions section, how the epic came to be associated with Gilgamesh posthumously. Finally, we'll wrap up this first episode of our Mesopotamia series and the Dawning Podcast with where you might find all the resources used for this episode, such as maps, character lists, the full script, and works cited. We will take a quick look at a charity that you might be interested in donating to. And lastly, we'll give a sneak peek at the episode airing next week. Part 1. Context. We're looking at a world called Sumer, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, at about 2800 BCE. This is a period that coincides with the early dynastic period in Egypt, the first or second of Manetho's dynasties. By now, ancient Sumer has established thriving city-states, its own pantheon and creation myth, and a language unrelated to any that survive today. We have evidence of the Epic of Gilgamesh having been written, at least at the earliest date, sometime around 2100 BCE, which coincides to the reign of Shulgi, a Neo-Sumerian king. Shulgi was a usurper who claimed Gilgamesh as his ancestor more than 500 years after Gilgamesh's death. Kings of ancient Sumer often claim as parents long-dead kings, legendary kings, mythical kings, and then gods and goddesses when they are usurpers, to establish some innate claim to the right to rule. However, they mostly used might and charisma, and as long as the rights of the civilians remained largely untouched, the citizenry were pretty ambivalent about who was sitting in the palace, legitimate or not. This is evidenced by the frequent coups and the resworn allegiances by officials who held their posts often longer than the kings did. More on that in episode 2. The epic represents the world's oldest story and is perhaps an amalgamation of folk tales and nature myths. It also shows us, quote, how early the tendency arose to attach to ancient tales the current religious teachings, unquote. During the summary of the epic, starting in chapter 4 through chapter 6, you may note some similarities to details of some Judeo-Christian texts. These will be briefly addressed in our postscript under conclusions. The Epic of Gilgamesh is separated into 6 chapters with a postscript. Chapters 1, 2, and the postscript all date to Shulgi's reign, around 2100 BCE. Chapters 3 and 4 date to between 1800 and 1500 BCE. Chapter 5 dates to about 1,000 years after the historical Gilgamesh's death, kind of in that window from chapters 3 and 4. And finally, chapter 6 dates to about 626 BCE from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who is the subject of a later episode of our series on Mesopotamia. Writing in ancient Sumer was typically used for economic purposes, record keeping. I like the way Bauer put it in chapter 8. She said that Sumerians were formed by a country in which every man needed to keep his elbows out against his neighbor's trespasses in order to survive. It's almost inevitable that writing came about in an environment of such distrust. It's a permanent state of declaration of ownership until the clay shatters. In case you didn't know, Sumerians wrote on clay or wax often. They would cut and shape reeds into little wedge-shaped tips and press their nibs into clay or wax. And that was the world's first writing, called cuneiform. While the Sumerian language is unrelated to all other languages we know of, many languages from this time and place used cuneiform to write. Akkadians and Elamites and others. It is in cuneiform that the epic is written, but the cuneiform used is in both Sumerian and Akkadian for different tablets of the epic. Part 2. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Chapter 1 is called The Tale of Enkidu. In its latest form, the epic begins with the people of Uruk, where Gilgamesh is king, pleading to the gods for deliverance from his tyranny. He is known to take advantage of a French phrase, so be prepared for my attempt. Droit du Seigneur, which translates to law of the Lord, meaning the king gets the first bedding of a man's bride. Yes, that is the R word. The people of Uruk get their prayers answered, and the gods create a rival for Gilgamesh out of clay called Enkidu. And he's a wild man, covered in hair or fur, and he eats and runs and sleeps with the animals in the forest. And a hunter happens upon him and is frightened by him. And in the newest versions of the epic, the hunter goes to Gilgamesh, who says to send a priestess or harlot of the temple, Shamat, to seduce and tame this wild man. And for 6 days and 7 nights, she tames him. Enkidu is no longer accepted by the animals of the forest once Shamat has tamed him. He has become human. He and Shamat return to Uruk, where Enkidu challenges Gilgamesh at a wedding before the poor bride is carried off by the tyrant. Enkidu and Gilgamesh wrestle, and depending on which version of the tale you read, sometimes Enkidu's successful in the older ones, sometimes Gilgamesh is successful in the newer ones, but no matter who succeeds, the outcome is the same. They become like brothers, and they go on adventures together. And they are equals. Chapter 2 is called Journey to the Cedar Forest, wherein Gilgamesh and Enkidu are bored, living up in their palace in Uruk, and they decide they should go to the Cedar Forest and defeat the giant Hugeness, or Humbaba. On the way there, Gilgamesh has nightmares about future endeavors that don't quite pan out, as you'll see in chapters 3, 4, and 6. Each time he wakes from his nightmare, Enkidu assures him, "This is the way to go. This is what we should do." They get to the forest and defeat Humbaba. It's all very theatrical. Then they chop down all the sacred trees that they can, build a raft, and float the timber down the river back to Uruk, where they put 2 giant wooden gates within the walls of Uruk. Chapter 3 is about the Bull of Heaven, in which the goddess Inanna, later Ishtar, wants Gilgamesh as her consort, and Gilgamesh rebuffs her. A lot of times in ancient tales, historians are loath to suggest 2 best friends are anything but platonic friends. I'm not. It sounds like Gilgamesh and Enkidu are gay to me and quite committed. I don't know, just sounds like Enkidu and Gilgamesh. Anyway, Gilgamesh rebuffs Inanna, saying she doesn't really treat her consorts very well. Inanna then goes up and has her father, An, send down the Bull of Heaven to attack Gilgamesh, but he and Enkidu defeat the bull. Enkidu removes the leg of the bull, throws it in Inanna's face, and says, "If I could hit you myself, I would." Enkidu and Gilgamesh are both cursed with a sickness, and Enkidu suffers for 12 days before dying. Chapter 4 is Gilgamesh's journey, in which he wants to restore himself to youth and vigor, and goes to the land of the immortal Utnapishtim. In Sumerian legend, Utnapishtim is the man who was warned of a worldwide flood by the gods, built an ark, put paired animals upon it, and repopulated the earth with his wife. Gilgamesh wants to meet him because Utnapishtim and his wife were rewarded with immortality for being the only righteous people upon the planet. Gilgamesh traverses mountains, a harrowing darkness, and a lake or river of death, and finally appears in the Garden of the Gods, or Garden of the Immortals, and finds Utnapishtim. Chapter 5 is the story of the flood, and a later insert, people think. It's unrelated to the narrative of the epic anyway. It's an older tale, probably from the Enuma Elish, which is the Sumerian flood story and creation myth. Utnapishtim says, "Let me tell you a story, Gilgamesh," and tells him the great long tale of how the gods thought humans were too loud, and they were going to silence them by flood. Worldwide flood. The god Ea warns Utnapishtim in a dream to build an ark and collect all the paired animals and his wife, his family, so that they can survive the flood, and only the unrighteous would be drowned. Utnapishtim sends out a dove who comes back, and then a raven who does not come back, and that is how he knows he will soon find dry land. Chapter 6 is Gilgamesh's quest, in which Gilgamesh confides in Utnapishtim that he is seeking immortality. Utnapishtim sets him a few tasks to prove himself worthy of eternal youth. He says, "Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. And Gilgamesh is like, "Yeah, I can do that," and then falls asleep immediately, waking up 5 days later and claiming, "I didn't fall asleep." But Utnapishtim's wife baked a loaf of bread each day he was asleep, per her husband's order. And upon Gilgamesh's waking and lying, Utnapishtim showed proof with all the loaves of bread in various states of decay, then said, "Okay, if you really want immortality, you'll have to get this plant at the bottom of a lake." So Gilgamesh goes to the lake, ties stones to his feet, sinks to the bottom, plucks the plant, and emerges from the waters victorious. On his long trek back from the Garden of the Gods, the mountains, the plain, he sets the plant aside one evening so that he can take a dip in a pond. And while he's bathing, a serpent slithers up, wraps itself around the stem of the plant, is renewed, sheds its old skin, and slithers away, young again. The plant, having been consumed, is nowhere to be found. Gilgamesh has failed his quest for immortality. He returns to Uruk, where his mighty walls rise in front of him, taller than any walls in Mesopotamia. And he kinda comes to terms with his own mortality then, because although he himself cannot live forever, his deeds and his accomplishments certainly can. That's a pretty optimistic note to end on, but it's a little like a game of telephone through multiple languages, cultures, even centuries. So it might be a little editorialized to suit a much more modern audience than we expect. Part 3. The prologue to the historical Gilgamesh. There are 4 cities in ancient Sumer that are really the four corners of the world in this part of history, in this story. The first you're a little familiar with already, at least from this podcast, Uruk. Uruk was probably the most populous city, with perhaps 50,000 people in and around the city. The walls of Uruk were said to be the best fortified, the highest, and according to Bauer, they were made of wood. The land of ancient Sumer was a very vertical series of kingdoms or city-states. Hundreds of miles long, perhaps, but maybe only 10 miles wide, according to a source within Bauer's work. The majority of the cities that we are talking about are nestled between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, as they are known from the Greek. The Tigris is the easternmost river, with waters that are fast and rough. In ancient times, it was called Idiglat, or swift like an arrow. Biblically, it was Hiddekel. The Euphrates, or Western River, was called Urutu, or biblically, Perat, for Copper River. Uruk was much closer to Urutu, or the Euphrates, on the southwestern side of the plain between the two rivers. It wasn't the strongest city, but probably it was the most populous and certainly the best fortified, with, as we've already learned, the tallest and best walls in all of Sumer. To the south, across the river, lay Ur. To the north of Uruk, just before the Tigris River, was the holy city of Nippur, where a contemporary of Gilgamesh named Enmebaragesi built the House of Enlil, which was commonly thought to be the god's favorite of all his temples. Nippur was a city of worship, and kings of Ur, Uruk, Kish, Lagash, and more would come there to pay tribute to the gods. To the northwest of Nippur, where the plain between the two rivers narrows, lay Kish, the jewel city of Sumer. A little bit like New York City, Kish was not the strongest city, nor the biggest. The biggest was Uruk, nor was it a political center. It lay simply between two rivers. As trade goods floated up and down the rivers, the king of Kish was able to pluck his tax from all that passed him by. This made Kish a very handsome prize to anyone ambitious enough to try to take it. One such ambitious man was the king of Uruk in about 2800 BCE, Meskia-Gashur. Meskia-Gashur was the son of the sun god Utu, so likely a usurper, and he was said to have, quote, entered the seas and ascended the mountains. Meskia-Gashur wanted Kish, and a note here. For a few generations, at least at this time of history, the king of Kish also held sway and sovereignty over the holy city of Nippur. It protected Nippur where, don't forget, kings from all across Sumer sent tribute to secure the favor of the gods. Meskia-Gashur knew, therefore, that if he attacked and conquered Kish, he would be king of Uruk, the most populous city, Kish, the city of trade and jewel of Sumer, and the holy city Nippur, with its tributes from all over Mesopotamia. He decided to go to war. But before he could do so, he had to fortify his armies. The plain between the rivers was abundant in grains and pottery, but not metals, not timber, nothing that would actually help him wage war, even on a smaller and lesser equipped city. Mesgiagashur had to take control of the trade routes to ensure his people could successfully reach the Copper Mountains in Magan, which lay in modern-day Oman. This is where he entered the seas. It's said that Sumerian reed boats were able to carry 20 tons of metal back to Uruk. However, copper was not as strong as bronze, and for about 300 years, according to Bauer, smiths had been combining copper with tin to form bronze. Tin could be found in mountains, either to the east in the Zagros, on the cusp of the hostile Elamite kingdom, or to the far north in the Elburz Mountains, just south of the Caspian Sea. Either way, Mesgiagashur was successful in quote-unquote ascending the mountains. He procured tin, he procured copper, he outfitted his army in bronze, but he died, and his throne passes to his son. His son is called Enmerkar, and Enmerkar doesn't really look at Kish the same way his father did. In fact, no one really knows why, but he really had his heart set on the Elamite settlement, Arada. Arada was a town to the northeast, and unlike Kish, didn't really offer any political benefits to those who might conquer it. But what Arada did have was a hoard of precious metals and stones, which they typically traded for grain. Enmerkar sent the Lord of Arada word that the goddess Inanna, patron deity of both Uruk and Arada, would prefer that the Elamites send their precious metals and stones to the Sumerians of Uruk free of charge, no grain in exchange. Enmerkar was declaring war. The Lord of Arada, whatever his name, called the bluff of Mesgiagashur's son. This whole exchange is detailed in Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada. Arada never fell, and by the time Enmerkar died, it was still under Elamite rule. Enmerkar had no children, no heirs, never expanded Uruk or its influence, not like his father had, and likely suffered a humiliating defeat at Arada, despite the preparations made for his army by his father. He was succeeded by his fellow warrior, Lugalbanda. Some unrelated warrior succeeded Lugalbanda, and on and on. There weren't many father-son successions for about 100 years or so, and another usurper seizes the throne, and this usurper is named Gilgamesh. Part 4. The Historical Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was very likely a usurper. For although the text by Bauer claims his father was likely a high priest of An in the city of Uruk, Gilgamesh officially claimed his parents were the goddess Ninsun and the long-dead warrior king Lugalbanda, who probably has been dead for decades by the time Gilgamesh comes to power. Gilgamesh, like his predecessor, King Meskia-Gashur, really wants to conquer Kish. Like Meskia-Gashur, though, he knows that he has to fortify his army and maybe, fortify the famous walls of Uruk too. You can see this somewhat reflected in the epic. He and Enkidu go to the cedar forests, and rather than Humbaba, says Bauer, probably they ran into some Elamite tribes. Or Gilgamesh did. Enkidu is probably not a fixture with a direct, real-life parallel to the historical king of Uruk. Once he fortifies the walls of his city, Gilgamesh begins the trek to Kish. And this is a long, hard march. The king of Kish at this time is a man who has been king for decades. The 22nd king after the flood that wiped out the entire world. Enmebaragesi, who ruled sometime around 2700 BCE, or at least lived then, responsible for building the splendid temple complex dedicated to the god Enlil, patron of the city Kish, and who had sent the flood 22 kings ago in a fit of, crankiness. We know that Gilgamesh is unsuccessful because Enmebaragesi, after decades of rule, likely attributed to the favor he garnered from Enlil, is able to pass his throne peacefully to his son, Aga. We don't know exactly what kept Gilgamesh from being successful, but we know that his people were not really on board. Perhaps this is reflected in the epic, when the Council of Elders tells Gilgamesh, quote, "You are young, Gilgamesh. Your heart carries you away. The giant is not like men who die." Perhaps this is them saying you can't just conquer a city, that's just rude. Maybe I'm stretching. He certainly did not have the support of his people, and as I mentioned earlier, according to Bauer, quote, Sumerians, formed by a country in which every man needed to keep his elbows out against his neighbor's trespasses in order to survive, seemed to have a keen sense of their own rights. They were the first people to write down their law codes, inscribing the limits to others' freedom so that there could be no mistake. They were not likely to suffer a king's encroachments for long without objecting, end quote. And in this case, they declined to go to war anymore. Since he doesn't like what the Council of Elders has to say, Gilgamesh goes to the Council of Able-Bodied, or Young Men, where he gets them all worked up by saying, quote, "Never before have you submitted to Kish." And after a little bit, they support his idea. Quote, "Do not submit to the house of Kish. Should we young men not smite it with weapons? The great gods created Uruk, and its great walls touch the clouds. The army of Kish is small, and its men cannot look us in the face." End quote. Since Gilgamesh hears what he was hoping to hear, he goes on to attack Kish for a second time. But the attack drags on, and the people of Uruk protest again, and again. Gilgamesh has to come home with no prize. But while Gilgamesh had been wandering the cedar forests and breaking down the timber to fortify the walls of Uruk, and while he attacked Kish, which was many miles away, not once but twice, the city to the south of Uruk, across the Euphrates, called Ur, was able to slowly gather strength and watch and wait. And King of Ur, Masanapada, attacked Kish right after Gilgamesh retreated for the second time. And he was successful. Masanapada was probably even older than Enma-Baragesi. Gilgamesh certainly must have been pretty burnt that he was not the first Sumerian conqueror in all of history. But he's not stupid. Fiery and temperamental maybe, but Gilgamesh learned from Masanapada's patience. And he waited, probably until the elders of Uruk had finally died off after seeing him defeated 2 times. And he waited until Masanapada was succeeded by his son, Meskiaguna. And kind of like the deal with Meskiagashur of Uruk about 100 years ago, leaving a prime and ready army to conquer Kish to his son Enmerkar, and the son failing to live up to the might and reputation of his father, Meskiaguna, the son of Kish's first conqueror, Masanapada, lost the city of Kish, its vassal Nippur, and Ur to Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, in one fell swoop, became the king of the 4 greatest cities of ancient Sumer: Uruk, Kish, Nippur, and Ur. He ruled more of Sumer than any other king before him. Maybe that's a little bit about why he became such a fixture in later tales and came to eventually be deified. Because we can see very clearly he wanted something so badly, and he may not have gotten it in the most direct way, but just like in the epic, he wanted and wanted immortality. In his real life, he wanted and wanted Kish and Nippur, because that represented something new that Sumer had never seen before. That's the stuff of legends. Meskiagashur couldn't do it, Enmerkar couldn't do it, even legendary Lugalbanda couldn't do it. Gilgamesh got what he wanted, in the epic and in his real life. Probably in the epic because he had in his real life. Who doesn't want to know that the protagonist got what he wanted in the end? In the epic, Gilgamesh went past the end of the world into the land of the immortals, collected the plant of everlasting life, lost it to a serpent, and returned to his home of Uruk feeling defeated, until he saw the great works that he had created, the mighty walls of Uruk, which even in the epic he was credited with building. In the beginning of the epic, when he is ready to launch an attack on Humbaba, which we know now is the first step to his attempt at conquering Kish, Gilgamesh said, quote, "Who can go up to heaven? Only the gods dwell forever. Men number their days. But even if I fall, I will win fame. Fame will last forever." He may not have found literal bodily immortality, but in his works and in his accomplishments, he was satisfied that his life, the memory of Gilgamesh, would exist forever. And it hasn't been forever yet, but he's had almost a 5,000-year streak. I want to read to you the lament at the end of the epic. "You were given the kingship. Everlasting life was not your destiny. You have the power to bind and loose, supremacy over the people, victory during battle. But do not abuse this power. Deal justly with your servants in the palace. The king has laid himself down. He is gone into the mountain. He will not come again. The enemy that has neither hand nor foot, that drinks no water and eats no meat, the enemy lies heavy on him. This lament doesn't quite fit the optimistic tale that we've come to know as the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's older than chapters 3 through 6 by at least 300 years. But it doesn't quite fit the historical Gilgamesh either, because after trial upon trial, making it onto the throne as a usurper, holding on to the power as an illegitimate and unliked king, building up the walls of Uruk to surpass, not even rival, those of cities that were ruled by people who'd been in power for decades, like Enma-Baragessi in Kish or Misanapata in Ur. And the two campaigns marching all the way up the Sumerian plain to attack Kish after having fortified his walls with wood from the holy cedar forest, likely all the way up in modern-day Lebanon. Gilgamesh attained immortality. And even more than 5,000 years after his death, his name is still spoken. Postscript. Conclusions. Section 1. Enkidu. Quote, not only is Enkidu originally an entirely independent figure, having no connection with Gilgamesh, but that the latter is really depicted in the epic as the counterpart of Enkidu, a reflection who has been given the traits of extraordinary physical power that belong to Enkidu. End quote. Professor Morris Jastrow, Jr. There is reason to believe the original protagonist of the Epic of Gilgamesh was Enkidu. He represented humankind's evolution from nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe to agricultural city dweller. Enkidu is made of clay, created of the earth, at first wild and untamed, walking and running and eating and living among the animals, among the wilderness, sometimes depicted with the horns of a bison and hooved legs. And then later he is civilized, comes to the city, becomes cultured, and even as important as a king. Professor Morris Jastrow, Jr. believes that the epic was retrofitted to shoehorn Gilgamesh into common, familiar folktales starring Enkidu, and that later those were combined with nature myths starring an array of deities who were replaced by Gilgamesh. For example, in the old Chapter 1, instead of the hunter going to Gilgamesh, it is the son of a hunter who first sees Enkidu. And he goes to his father, and his father suggests the harlot. This is a very clear indication that Gilgamesh has been added to a tale much later, because stories tend to add rather than subtract drama over time. Would it make sense if Gilgamesh were in the original tale, or indeed any king, that storytellers remove a tyrant in favor of a practical, unremarkable hunter? In Chapter 3, The Bull of Heaven, the bull's slayer and Inanna's rebuker originally appear to have been Enkidu. He insults her, throws the severed bull leg at her, and is stricken with a disease which kills him. Gilgamesh, besides his rebuke, is passive throughout. Professor Jastrow says, quote, "The details of the process which led to making Gilgamesh the favorite figure, to whom the traits and exploits of Enkidu are transferred, escape us. But of the fact that Enkidu is the older figure, of whom certain adventures were set forth in a tale that once had an independent existence, there can now be little doubt. Just as the study of these tablets show that in the combination of the tales of Enkidu and Gilgamesh, the former is the prototype, of which Gilgamesh is the copy. I'm not here to provide a hypothesis on who shoehorned in Gilgamesh or why or when, but a lot like when, as we mentioned earlier, a usurper takes the throne and calls himself the son of a long-dead king or the progeny of a much-loved goddess. It sounds a little bit like legitimizing someone who didn't have a legitimate claim to some idea of authority, some position of authority. Was it Shulgi? We don't yet know. Professor Jastrow compares Enkidu to a sort of Sumerian Hercules character, a folk hero who, quote, slays lions, overcomes a powerful opponent dwelling in the forests of Lebanon, kills the bull, and he finally succumbs to a disease sent as a punishment by an angry goddess, end quote. Enkidu's passing signaled the end of the original epic before the nature myths were added to focus on Gilgamesh. Jastrow continues, quote, "The epic's original form may, of course, have included other exploits besides those taken over into the Gilgamesh epic," end quote. Conclusions, Section 2, Nature Myths. Chapter 3 of the epic, wherein Enkidu and Gilgamesh battle the Bull of Heaven and the latter rebukes Inanna, Jastrow suggests is one of 3 nature myths. Gilgamesh represents the sun god, and the goddess Inanna in this story is the earth, which, quote, woos the sun in the spring, but whose love is fatal. For after a few months, the sun's power begins to wane, end quote. Gilgamesh in the epic denies her, and he, and less importantly to this point, Enkidu, is stricken with disease. Like the sun weakening into winter, Gilgamesh feels his mortality and, shall we use his words, numbering of his days. Chapter 4 shows Gilgamesh roaming hostile wilderness down into dark tunnels to eventually reach revitalization. This represents, Jastrow claims, the sun languishing in the dark days of winter, longing for spring. Chapter 5, the story of the flood, represents the rainy season, quote-unquote, which destroys all life in nature. Hence the reason it is inserted, clumsy though it may appear without the context of the nature myth theory. You can see a bit how the nature myth cycle starts in the 3rd chapter, which is also an episode that once belonged to Enkidu. So it's both one of his episodic adventures and a nature myth. Since seasons are cyclical, and Chapter 3 represented the beginning of Summer's End, it isn't unreasonable to suggest the others were added as the subsequent developments from the nature myth thread, sidestepping any more episodic adventures from original hero Enkidu. Quote, now with the tendency to attach to popular tales and nature myths lessons illustrative of current beliefs and aspirations, says Jastrow, Gilgamesh's search for renewal of life is viewed as man's longing for eternal life. Conclusions, Section 3, Biblical Themes. You will have noticed in our readings today a few details which mirror concepts from Judeo-Christian tradition. There's the man made by a deity from clay, his change from a nude man who lives among the animals to a clothed man who must farm for his food, the woman who triggers this change, the quest for everlasting life, the Garden of Immortals, a world-encompassing flood, a man who built an ark and paired the world's animals to repopulate the earth, the serpent who jeopardizes the protagonist's immortality by using a plant. This is not to say Abrahamic religious tradition draws from Sumerian fiction. That and the opposite have been argued already by people far better qualified than me. Jastrow offers his opinion, suggesting the names of both Gilgamesh and Enkidu were artificially Sumerianized, and perhaps the tale itself came from the Semitic settlers and was later taken over by the sedentary Sumerians. He goes on to say, quote, the presumption is in favor of an independent literary origin for the Semitic versions of the Gilgamesh epic, though naturally with a duplication of the episodes, or at least some of them, in the Sumerian narrative. End quote. Bauer echoes this sentiment in her work, allowing for similarities by way of older oral tales, common to the area where multiple cultural identities held sway. What is even more interesting than the collection of similarities in the Sumerian and Semitic stories is the difference in how they are regarded. Jastrow compares the phrase cursed ground in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Book of Genesis. In the former, Shemot, the temple harlot, tells Enkidu that they should leave this cursed ground so that she may return to civilization with him. What must she think of hunter-gatherers, of wandering tribes who have no city walls nor any agricultural practices? Now compare the disdain of Shemot for the nomadic lifestyle with Genesis 3:17. But to Adam he said, because you obeyed your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. The ground is cursed because of you. In painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, but you will eat the grain of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat food until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you will return. See how differently agricultural and nomadic lifestyles are viewed here. The Epic of Gilgamesh sees the settled urban life as an evolution, as optimistic. The Bible suggests it is a less pure way of living, even so far as a punishment, which, if you think about it, seems a bit counterintuitive to the idea of Abraham and Moses striving for a land to settle, presumably to build cities and establish agriculture. Why would the two cultures not agree on this? Jastrow compares biblical Adam's expulsion from nomadic life to Enkidu's celebratory step towards civilization. Quote, Enkidu is implored to leave the wilderness as a necessary step towards progress to a higher form of existence. End quote. Conclusions, Section 4. Homosexuality/bisexuality themes. In our review of the epic's third chapter, when Gilgamesh declines Inanna's offer, I remarked that historians sometimes seem to sidestep homosexuality as a viable possibility for the closeness of two inseparable friends. I found in a later reading session 2 excerpts from the first chapter of the epic, during which Gilgamesh confides in his mother about some nightmares he's been having. Jastrow translates a line from Gilgamesh himself, quote, "I saw him, and like a woman I fell in love with him." End quote. I feel that Jastrow summarizes this part better than I could. Quote, "The Pennsylvania tablet begins with 2 dreams recounted by Gilgamesh to his mother, which the latter interprets as presaging the coming of Enkidu to Uruk. In the one, something like a heavy meteor falls from heaven upon Gilgamesh and almost crushes him. With the help of the heroes of Uruk, Gilgamesh carries the heavy burden to his mother, Ninsun. The burden, his mother explains, symbolizes someone who, like Gilgamesh, is born in the mountains, to whom all will pay homage, and of whom Gilgamesh will become enamored with a love as strong as that for a woman. In a second dream, Gilgamesh sees someone who is like him, who brandishes an axe, and with whom he falls in love. This personage, the mother explains, is again Enkidu." End quote. What's interesting about this is that, on one hand, we have Enkidu, who was a fictional Hercules-type hero character, the sort of subject parents might tell their kids about as a bedtime story. On the other hand is Gilgamesh, who, while a bit tiresome for his contemporaneous subjects, became a household name for his taking the thrones of Sumer's 4 greatest cities at his time. And because of his historical feats, perhaps, he was rolled into the exploits of the folk hero Enkidu. This is taking 2 of their world's greatest heroes, who steal the love of courtesans and goddesses, who slay giants and bulls and lions, and pairing them together. And though artificial, as was Gilgamesh's entire presence in these tales, it shows me a culture that 5,000 years ago honored the idea that their greatest heroes were lovers. If I could take just a moment more of your time and direct you to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Palestinians recently got hit with 2 severe blows. Not only has the United States just endorsed Israel's invasions and war crimes, and thus become an active party in the invasion and attacks on Palestine and her long-suffering people, but Palestinians just lost one of their longest-serving diplomats 2 weeks ago. Syed Erekat served Palestine for 30 years, working for a 2-state solution. Now that he's passed away, United States Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has gone to the West Bank and said that Israel's invasion settlements are not only legitimate, but those protesting Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territory will be labeled anti-Semitic, and that imports from those illegal settlements will be considered legal Israeli imports in the United States. Boris Johnson in the UK is trying to pass legislation echoing Pompeo's words and intent. After losing an important ally in Syed Erekat, Palestinians are losing hope for official support, one country at a time. If you have the means, I encourage you to donate as I have. Even $1 is more than nothing, and if you cannot afford that, sharing a link is a great help. Please see the proper link in the description. I want to thank you for listening to Gilgamesh the Sumerian. Your views, likes, and comments encourage me to read more and share what I find so that we can learn together. For all visual aids, such as maps, character lists, and the full-text script of this episode, please visit thedawningpodcast.wordpress.com, where you can also catch sneak peeks of future episodes and even vote on the next series. The next episode in the Mesopotamia series will air on January 11th with the title Sargon the Akkadian. That's next time on the Dawning Podcast. Thank you very much.